This is Planet Poet Words in Space at WIOX Radio, and I'm so happy to welcome my returning guest, the unique poet and novelist Lee Slonimsky, here in the WIOX studio to discuss his new poetry collection and other things. The collection is called Bright Yellow Buzz. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Sharon. Great to be here.
It's so great that you're here in the studio. It's really a pleasure. Let me read your bio. Lee Slonimsky's sonnet sequence, Pythagoras in Love, has been translated into French and Greek, was published in Polish this summer, and will soon be translated into Italian. His poem, Dragonflies in Love, was included in the new anthology, BuzzWords, Poems About Insects. Everyman's Library Poet Series, edited by Kimiko Hahn and Harold Schechter. Lee's newest American collection, Bright Yellow Buzz, was just published by Spuyten Duyvil Press. Lee earns a living managing a hedge fund called Ocean Partners LP. Lee, this is your 10th book of poetry?
Yes.
That's quite an achievement.
Thank you. I mean, poets have published 100 books, but, you know, it's not a numbers contest, but it's nice to hang around long enough to, you know, get to 10, I guess.
Absolutely. Why don't you start us off with a poem?
Okay, this is the opening poem in the book, and its title is Vesuvius. He had that very morning been quite struck by sunlight on his courtyard tiles, by how the light appeared to have a quality he'd never seen before, a gauzy look, web-like, as if imprisoning. Allow for his own dreaminess, he still could see this light was different. It made red tiles glow as if they surged from bubbling fire below. The tiles enclosed a shallow, pale blue pool that shimmered with the rising sun's hot rays. He lingered with this light show, radiant, for hours, did no work, lost in a maze of brightness, shadow, a pawn of weather's rule. Then, barely noticed, one charred cloud. What's that?
That's Lee Slonimsky reading his poem, Vesuvius. Indeed, what's that? That's the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The quality of this poem is so dreamy, and nobody can expect what's going to be happening. And in the first line you said he had that very morning been quite struck by sunlight, but that quite struck can refer to what happens, the ensuing disaster that happens.
It's purely imaginary setting. I did actually make some efforts after I wrote the poem to verify the sequence. I was most concerned that the eruption could have happened in the early morning, in which case the poem would be impossible. But it didn't, and actually it was quite a bit later in the day. And there were, there's no record in terms of exact time, but clearly, most people were caught totally unawares. So, I was trying to evoke the kind of cliche, in a way, calm before the storm, but also how unreal what was about to happen. Yes. Just one other point. I mean, again, in the historical record, there had been nervousness actually for a couple of years in the area because of some activity that was going on with Vesuvius. But they didn't have, of course, the scientific metrics we have now. And, I feel that, in general, you can, as they say, I mean, anything can happen at any moment. And this is, this is something that was so extreme that it's become a legend and a legend in history.
Well, it's the, of course, this is Pompeii that you're describing. It's a very sensual poem. It's a poem that's really caught in that gauzy, web-like sun, as if imprisoning, and you put that in italics, the two as a portent, I would imagine. It's a very interesting poem to start your collection with, Lee. Why did you start with this poem?
Well, it has a number of themes in it that are present throughout the collection that had taken a few different forms. I started to put it together, I would say, probably late in 2020. So, it's over a year. There were several different versions of it. But the ancient world, the kind of both synergy between nature and human experience, but also the kind of tension, which I think you allude to very astutely, that I tried to convey in the poem, between something that can be beautiful and yet devastating. And, there was a sort of probably very visual aspect to the poem's concept, which also reflects a lot of the other poems.
And you have another poem later on in the collection called about the Lisbon Earthquake. If you would read that one for us?
Sure. I'd say this poem is the earliest poem in this collection, which has mostly recent poems. So this poem was written in 1984 and is one of the first poems that I had that was kind of accepted by a prominent journal. Before the Lisbon Earthquake. In the days before the Lisbon Earthquake, many warnings were given. Birds were heard speaking in tongues. Children spat up blood as they dreamed of ruins. Along the coast, not so far away, waves turned crimson at nightfall. Moonlight mixed with their rosy glow to create pink, blood-like shadows. But no one paid attention. In an asylum, a madman dreamed the entire event in vivid detail. Because he claimed God gave him the news, he was ignored, then threatened. Most telling of all were the stones, ordinary rocks, paving blocks throughout the streets, and boulders on the outskirts of town, all cracked in spectacular sequence, new lines and fissures appearing at once, forming events in every known language, spelling out imminent doom. Some rocks even duplicated what was coming, splitting to bits without ready cause, imitating earthquake's pure chaos, the ground's disobedience to its own strength. No one read the ground beneath them at all, except for an old woman named Isabel Lopez, who heard birds' warnings and read rocks' letters. Her recognition was deemed so outlandish that her family hid her in their cellar, where she was one of the first to die. One mini whirlwind of sapphire light went so far as to warn an 8-year-old boy darting through alleyway shadows, looking for fruit rolled off a wagon. Like the rest of the city, his family did not believe because they'd never heard of a prophet come as a wave, a rock, a bird, or an amorphous being bathed in blue light, not as a statue in some church alcove. On the day the earthquake came, there was no warning at all.
That's beautiful, Lee. Before the Lisbon Earthquake by Lee Slonimsky. It's so amazing. I love, you've done this in the past. You sort of animate, you give stones and rocks portent and meaning beyond what most people think of them as inanimate things. And you talk about the ground's disobedience to its own strength, which is a beautiful line among so many. And then you concretize this by naming a woman, Isabel Lopez, which gives it this very, again, sensual description. It concretizes it. It keeps it down to earth. And the sapphire light. When was this earthquake, Lee?
Once upon a time, I knew the exact date. It's definitely in the 1700s. I'm not going to guess past that.
Right.
But it was certainly interesting in terms of the Enlightenment was underway. Science was underway. It wasn't the Middle Ages. But, it was an event that Lisbon's a major city, and it it really caught Europe by storm when it happened, and it was a terrible event, like the Galveston flood in the United States, which, although not an earthquake, still the greatest disaster in American history in 1900. Although not an earthquake, it had a seismic connection. I think it was kind of something like a tidal wave. So, it's a cousin to the Galveston flood.
Lee, you include the Greek translation of the poem in the collection, and it looks so beautiful on the page. I don't read Greek, but it has a pictorial effect of just generally a beautiful look on the page. And could you talk briefly about the translation of this poem?
Sure. Well, I have a colleague who is also a translator for me in Greece, Stamatis Polonakis, who actually was co-winner of the 2017 Greek National Poetry Prize. And he, just in the course of regular correspondence, he's written a number of well, he has a kind of disaster thread in some ways in his poetry, and actually quite chillingly, there's a book under consideration for publication in the United States now, which is titled The Odessa Steps, which acquired some additional grim meaning here. But so Stamatis, liked the poem, and he translated it. And I am learning Greek at the moment, very, very slowly. And
right,
that's probably
as adults do.
Yeah, very slowly, but I am, and so he, I think has done a masterful job with the poem.
You're listening to Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio, live and local in the Catskills. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and I'd like to reintroduce my in-studio guest, poet and novelist Lee Slonimsky, here to discuss his latest poetry collection, Bright Yellow Buzz. And I'm going to start this portion of the program with an accolade by Dr. Robert Basner, who Lee will talk about later. And here it is. Lee Slonimsky's poetic achievement in Bright Yellow Buzz is more than technique, more than memory. Though master technique and master memory are everywhere in this work, it is nothing less than spirit's truth, which is quite beautiful and true. It reminds me of your immersion in the life of Pythagoras. Lee, why don't you read a Pythagoras poem that you have included in this collection for us?
Yeah, I just want to mention, as far as Dr. Robert Basner, that he was very generous to write such a supportive introduction for the book.
Amazing.
And he's himself a brilliant poet who lives in the Hudson Valley and
has been on the show.
Right,
yeah.
has been on the show in the past year. Okay, so Pythagoras is not named in this poem, but he's the subject. The title is Bird, Flower, Waves. He's nicknamed colleagues in the art of math his fellow primers, those who sequence well the indivisible numbers that are true immortals, irreversibly whole as gods should be. This morning on his path atop a seaside cliff, he notices two, a bluebird singing full of lilt and wit, and when her notes are counted, prime, quite true to their shared mind. The other, flower, wise, blue petal counts irregular and prime always. Both blue just like the shimmering sea that sunlight lathers. Waves curl into foam at intervals. Math students too.
That's Bird, Flower, Waves by Lee Slonimsky. Both blue, like the shimmering sea that sunlight lathers. There's sunlight again. Would you talk about this poem in terms of the essence of Pythagoras, if you will, and how Pythagoras has You wrote a book, of course, called Pythagoras in Love that's been translated into Greek, Polish, and soon into Italian.
And French.
Of course, by Lisbeth Coleman.
Also a very talented,
Very talented.
I guess you could say somewhat Hudson Valley.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful translation. So, talk about Pythagoras a little bit, Lee, at this stage when you've written your 10th book.
So I stumbled upon Pythagoras as a somewhat alter ego about 20 years ago, misremembering Petrarch as Pythagoras, and so the poems that result, they combine fairly authenticated details about Pythagoras' viewpoint, which was essentially that math was the central divine language of the universe, in the same way that in the Hebrew tradition, the word, which we also see capital letters as a adjective in Christianity, it was number for Pythagoras. And in terms of the natural world, there were certainly legendary traditions indicating an intense interest in animals. But I basically created or in my mind was creating a certainly somewhat fictional character. Mm-hmm. But I did learn about 15 years later, in continuing to do research on Pythagoras, really a very startling fact, and that is that Petrarch, who I had misremembered as Pythagoras, actually historically was deeply influenced by Pythagoras. The mathematical connection to poetry, and also Pythagoreanism was actually closer to what we nowadays would call a religion than it was to a mathematical discipline. And Petrarch wrote an essay that survives, a 2-paragraph essay to the effect that Petrarch wrote this essay to the effect that Pythagoras was his Jesus. And it's a sentiment that turns out more covertly to have been shared by Dante. So that, really it just fleshes out the sort of, blind luck or good fortune, because I had no special knowledge to confuse their names. But I have been, in a way, I think, almost uplifted a bit by the fact that this connection, which was made around 1300, so that's that's only 1/3 of the way into the past to where Pythagoras, who lived 500 BC, and yet that this connection in some cyclical way maybe has continued.
When Robert Basner talks about spirit's truth, does that have something to do with Pythagoras' truth, the truth of math, and also the constant flow from the inanimate to the animate? How you manifest Pythagoras' spirit.
I find personally, I guess you could say spiritual meaning in nature, and certainly it's nothing remotely unique about that. I think, even in an area like the Catskills, you may be more likely to find people who have that kind of response if they moved here and didn't grow up here in particular. But the spiritual, I can't speak for exactly what Robert was referring to, but in terms of my own sense, I do feel that there is, first of all, a spiritual life in the lives of animals that has been completely neglected and abused for, unfortunately, millennia. And then also even with trees, that they do have a spiritual sense to them, and that I feel like I kind of draw sustenance from that.
Well, you've written about in your poems about how trees and tree and human DNA are similar. They have a common ancestry, and they diverge.
Right.
Diverged.
I just want to say that's an amazing thing. That's a discovery that actually was made. That I first became aware of it in the news right around 1990, and they actually have. It's 1.1 billion years old. They actually have a specimen of DNA which they believe on the issue of mobility was right on the verge between the genetic strain that would be able to walk and the genetic strain that would remain immobile.
Oh my goodness!
It's a fantastic moment.
My God.
I don't. the two moments, and I've written about them a lot in other books, that to me are just, and not just to me, but the moment when that split occurred between mobility and immobility, and then about 370 million years ago when the first aquatic or semi-aquatic fish or
in the Devonian,
reptile actually crawled onto land. I mean, these are the two probably, well, I'm going to call this the modern history since it goes back 3.8 billion years, but in the modern history of life on Earth, these have to be two of the most, just totally dramatic moments. And there is a poet, a favorite poet of mine, a poet from North Carolina named Sarah Lindsay, who I have been influenced by, who has written really poems that, especially on the issue of life coming from the sea on land, that do give tribute to this really. What's especially spectacular is that they are so precisely known. I mean, they have, for example, a DNA specimen relating to the split between, it's between plant life at the time and animal life. I mean, trees don't actually develop, I think, until fairly. I'm no expert, but I think it's about 350 million years ago. They're not around for that first period, but they, of course, are the descendants of plant life.
Sort of an amorphous edge between the animate and the animated, I guess, and the immobile.
Yes.
Would you read another related poem?
Well, I have another Pythagoras
Yes.
poem, yes, that I just want to say briefly. There is a fairly well-known narrative of his life circumstances. He was a very prominent person, actually, and he was exiled in the last decades of his life.
This is Pythagoras?
Pythagoras, to a place in northern Italy called Metapontum. Some believe partly because of resentment of a vegetarian lifestyle that he supported in Crotona, which was where he was advisor to the king. But in any event, the setting of this poem is that in the exile, he is trying to go back to Athens to give a lecture, missing, I guess, a community of other thinkers. And the title is, and Samos is his birthplace, so the title is A Beach in Samos, Quiet Light. This late life opportunity astounds, although he's known for months it could occur. A year's release to lecture once again on leafery at the academy. While in Athens he finds a boat, a steady wind is favorable to reaching his old shore. This morning he begins to make the rounds of boyhood haunts, a rough biography of how his deepest vision came to be. These gulls that glide and swerve adroitly were the earliest to teach him math of flight, remain his sun-washed, surf-commanding peers. He's not too old to wonder how sunlight has learned so many angles perfectly.
That's Lee Slonimsky reading A Beach in Samos, Quiet Light. I love the way you emphasize the iambic pentameter in this. Is this a sonnet, Lee?
Yes.
Yes, you write many sonnets. And I when I first started writing poetry, I was very, very lucky to be in Lee's class, walking with the sonnet in Manhattan at the 92nd Street Y. Elizabeth Coleman was in there and many other friends, and we were all happily mentored by Lee's brilliant ideas and gentle kindness.
Those were the good old days.
I just want to say, Lee, with my in-studio guest, Lee Slonimsky, you talk about in this poem about leafery. Is that a word that you created?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's a little pompous to think you can create a
No,
word.
oh
but
no. I want to read. I want to read this section by Dr. Robert Basner, who wrote the beautiful introduction to Lee's book, and he talks about Lee's word configurations and imagination. While phrases in a Slonimsky poem of any form suffuse in assured assonance and consonance, he is readily recognizable on the page by the compounded word. Such word compounding, seen, for example, in the verse from The Waiting, Still, and Glaze, in branch-sharp shadows from the poem Summer School, and perhaps most beautifully of all in these, at beak shape, wing fluff, any resemblance that might inspire recognition from the poem Antidote, as if one sun ray has soaked this leaf amidst loud, sweet waters from Glaze. And Robert goes on to say that these that his word compounding is in inspired kinship with Hopkins and Celan, and with Slonimsky's own honored and longtime mentor, colleague, and friend, former consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress, Daniel Hoffman. So that's a beautiful tribute, and very, we don't get a chance to talk enough about poets creating their own compound words. And did Daniel Hoffman do that? I know Celan does. Could you speak a little bit about that, Lee?
Yes, I'm actually not aware of that being a prominent aspect of Daniel Hoffman's work, but he has a tremendous sensibility to words and sense of words, and kinship, which I think is the beginning phrase in Robert's sentence, can be referring to the intensity of the language, I think, in these poets, more than maybe just the issue of compounding words. But I will say on leafery, of course, it's a pretty simple sounding word, but actually the sense of those sorts of words that I have been using recently in reference to, I'll give you another one from a more recent poem, and which will sound a little bit far-fetched, but I use the word flufferer. That's fluff, or a flufferer is actually a painter who specializes in representing clouds in a fluffy manner. But in terms of leafery, it's really someone who's interested in in leaves from a mathematical vantage point. And that, I think, we don't have that much, certainly in the English language. I think there are other languages that may use this more, but basically we have botanist and other kinds of fancy Latin-based scientific words, but this is not really related to a scientific interest. It's more, well, mathematics, you could say, is a kind of science, but it's more related to maybe what we would typically call mysticism. So a leaferer, as I said, a flufferer. I've made up hundreds of them, and fittingly can't think of any others. But still, that's the concept. And I'll also mention Celan, who's not a poet I have read much, and recently another poet friend of mine mentioned him, so he is someone I need to catch up on the reading
and that's
of.
Paul Celan. I think he's a Czech poet.
Yeah,
I think he's Czech. He changed his name. Sounds more French, but
right.
He's not a French poet.
And Hopkins, of course, when I was young, tremendous. I mean, certainly very influential, and a very profoundly great poet in a linguistic way.
I am fascinated, Lee. You have a section in the book about Macbeth and the play, and would you read Macbeth's Castle, Philosopher's Woods?
Yes, I would say also these poems are somewhat based on or inspired by a trip in 2016 that my wife, Carol Goodman, the famous and great mystery writer, and I made to it's probably the east coast of Scotland, about 70 miles up from Edinburgh. And on one of our walks, I was startled to learn, although I never actually got there, that about 10 miles away was the castle that is known to have been the basis for the castle described in Macbeth.
So you just came upon it? You weren't
We
seeking
did
it?
not. In the poems, the narrator stumbles across it, but we actually never saw it. We never saw it. We just were told by someone local that it was nearby. And that was, it was startling. Okay. Macbeth's Castle, Philosopher's Woods. We slowly make out ramparts in the gloom as we approach, traversing muddy woods and wind-strewn bramble from the recent storm. The castle is a ruin, and yet walls seem as solid as Prince Hamlet's flesh. Rank weeds are everywhere, but towers still have form aloft, while yellow pennants flutter high against the foggy, gust-twirled sky. We stride no more, unnerved. Observe a face quite fleeting in a window, pale, austere. Perhaps she isn't pleased by our approach. We'd seen a photo. Wreckage should be near, and not this trembling, full-blown relic. Such is reason's endless instability that when her face returns, we turn and flee. Deep Scottish truth seems well beyond our reach, obscured by shadows we can never breach.
A beautiful end couplet on that.
Thank you.
That's Lee Slonimsky reading Macbeth's Castle, Philosopher's Woods. And I guess Lady Macbeth made her appearance as a shadow in that poem. Am I right?
Well, I don't think it's made completely clear. I have several that didn't get into the book, and one of them, Lady Macbeth, is absolutely a character. But it certainly is, I think, suggestive that it could be her.
I love when you say we'd seen a photo, which brings it into the present in a funny way, actually. It's great. And you have your compound words here, wind-strewn, gust-twirled, which I love, gust-twirled. And why do you call the title, Macbeth's Castle, Philosopher's Woods? I have a twinge of Pythagoras here.
I think the concept of the title is that when you see something that is really, jarring and unbelievable in many ways, that it does raise these traditional questions. What I call reason's endless instability includes whether what you see is completely in your mind or whether it's really there, which of course is the British philosopher Berkeley, who got kicked in the leg famously by someone who was trying to make the point that it is really there. So more, and it also in another poem it refers back to David Hume, who, an English philosopher but of Scottish descent, who, one of the major first modern philosophers of late 17th, early 18th century. So kind of suggesting that this is an area, and actually it is true in Scotland, that this is something very kind of isolated and very somewhat primordial that does provoke maybe philosophical thoughts.
Yeah. You really set the atmosphere beautifully. Especially, I love the walls seem as solid as Prince Hamlet's flesh. That's a great line.
Yeah, that's of course the much debated over 4 centuries, with the split being, that this too solid flesh should melt, or is it that this too soiled flesh, which I think is one of the 4 folios, and which I first learned about many years ago, and I give away in this poem that I have always believed the word was solid.
Interesting.
I'm no scholar, but the idea was that solid matched a little better with melt. It didn't say that the soiled flesh should become clean. So that is, I think, the consensus. But that's what that line refers to.
In Macbeth.
Yes. No, no, in the poem.
Hamlet?
In the poem. The line in Hamlet is Hamlet in one of the soliloquies says, "Oh, that this too solid flesh should melt."
Right.
He's expressing some
Oh, I see.
some dissatisfaction with his life circumstances, let's say.
Lee, would you read, and you bring us to Macbeth's castle, the reader of this book, and we're steeped in the atmosphere. But you also bring art into your book in a new way, I believe, in this collection. Would you read Vermeer at Tupper Lake for us?
Yes, and the Tupper Lake is, for those of you who know it, the Tupper Lake in the Adirondacks.
Right.
Okay. Vermeer near Tupper Lake. A delicate gold figure, lightly traced upon a wan white petal, looks just like an open scroll perched on a music stand. A nature miniature. You pause to look, amazed by craftsmanship, as if you found Vermeer of the precise. What wonders never cease in wood's gust-blown deep repertoire? How does this flower know a scroll, an orchestra? The patterns present on more petals, wild the way they form a school of art. Bee buzz, lark chirp, do they read music from gold petal etchings? Summer chorus lilts soft air around the flowers, breezed leaves hum as background. Hummingbirds' wings whir.
Lovely. Vermeer near Tupper Lake.
Thank you.
The delicate gold figure, could that be a bee also, or?
I mean, it's an actual flower which I never bothered to identify, and actually I found it growing in the woods outside of Woodstock, New York.
So evocative.
It's a kind of a heart-shaped, thin line, very, very microscopically thin, that did look like, an impression of a scroll on a music stand.
And tell us how did you think of Vermeer within this poem?
I am intensely ignorant about art, and I have started in the last year and a half to write a sequence. Really with 2 or 3 different protagonists about painters who were struggling in various ways. And but I've always, I simply like Vermeer. I've always liked Vermeer, and that's why there wasn't any deeper reason that I'm aware of anyway.
I love bee buzz and lark chirp. So this is interesting how artifice and nature combine in your poems by you describing the nature, this flower, like a scroll, and bringing music, art, and other artifice into it. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Lee?
About the connection between painting and nature?
Yeah.
I think, in some ways I have gravitated towards painting poems as a way to write about poetry, honestly, that is not so self-involved and could fall into the trap of being really tedious. I've always had a shyness about writing. There are ways to do. My wife does it brilliantly, and she does it as a considerable theme in her work. But so some of it is also probably a lifelong of highly sublimated interest in being a painter, and then I think what drives it as a concept is the idea that these, the fantastic natural beauty that we see, whether it's just sunlight filtered through the trees or, a waterfall, that it is an art of nature to see that. And I'm not trying to, I'm not using any sort of transcendental belief here, simply that, nature really only has like atoms and molecules to work with, and yet you see that that's a type of painting, and that for the painter, getting close to that kind of creator with a small c mentality can result in great art. And then the final piece is that I find the struggles of painters, and it's true for any artist, musicians, novelists, but they can be metaphors for the challenges of being a poet, especially in a time when poetry's logistical support is almost entirely in the university, and not everyone is cut out for that. So painting has more actually of a, if you want to say, free enterprise,
right? It's
support system.
It's part of the capitalist system right now.
It is, but at the same time, it's a type of support that very few painters get.
Yes,
so
exactly.
In many ways, some of them have fallen back now on the university, and in many ways, all artists face these challenges.
Yes. Lee, you also write in haiku now, which I think is new for you also. And that's the epitome of nature poetry.
I have been writing haiku occasionally, probably for many years. I last couple of years I read an amazing book of haiku, which I have to apologize not knowing the title of at the moment. But Stu Bartow, who is somewhat a local poet. I mean, he's an Adirondack poet. That's Bartow. Who I've known for years. He's published 2 books of haiku that were very influential on me. I really felt he was just taking the form in amazing directions. So
Stu Bartow?
Bartow, yes. He's a very distinguished poet whose books can be found certainly very easily on Amazon. So that has been a support for it. But I've also learned to maybe try to do haiku after I've written a longer poem as a sort of exercise or challenge to express the same theme in much fewer words.
There's a new form now called Burning Haibun, where you start with a prose poem, then the second part is a poem, and the last part is a haiku, which I think very interesting. That's a relatively new. Would you read 2 of your haiku for us?
Yes,
one
I'd
at a
be
time?
very
Thank
happy
you.
to. This may be the first time I've ever publicly
Yeah.
read haiku in my life. So.
I feel honored.
Yeah, well, let me hope I don't blow my lines, as few as there are. Okay, late summer. Butterflies lecture on flutter with rapid wings. Breezes learn quickly.
That's great. And that is the 575 form.
Yeah, I'm very much a traditionalist on that point.
And you have all the elements of a Slonimsky poem in here, breezes, butterflies.
Right. I do try.
Wings.
I'd say more
Wonderful.
often than not, I do try to restate a theme in a poem that I've literally just written.
Yeah, that's great.
Like 5 minutes before.
Uh-huh.
This is kind of, in a way, an autobiographical travel poem. In that it's literally true. Trip to Paros, underwater. Byron's graffiti glimmering on the seawall at a shallow depth. I'd like to say that I saw it. What I actually saw, we went to Paros in 2018, and we were trying to get a ferry that went a short distance to an adjacent, much smaller island, and we had just missed it. The sun was very bright, so I was reading kind of a guidepost, and the guidepost mentioned that Byron had been there and left his graffiti. So that's what the poem. It's autobiographical in that way.
Great, Lee. We're running out of time. This has gone so fast, as usual when you're on the show. Just let us know if people want more information about your books, where to find them, and upcoming events, links, etc.
Thank you. Well,
you're welcome.
Obviously, I've been kind of, during the pandemic, I guess. I did do a reading, which was quite a thrill, really, in Greece last fall at the Thessaloniki International Book Fair. But right now, I guess my latest thing to report is that my new book, Bright Yellow Buzz, is just available on Amazon, and I do plan and hope to start scheduling some readings for it. But I was as unanticipating the current improvement as I was the crisis before it. I've missed it at every turn, so I haven't actually.
Well, it's wonderful that you came on here to read your new poems in this beautiful book, so thank you.
Yeah, it's been years since we've done this
in
the studio.
It's very special.
It's very nice. Yes.
So would you end with a poem that actually has the title of the book in it?
Right. The title of the book is not the title of this poem, but it actually does come from this poem. I was leafing. I can say very briefly that the original title of this book was Wither, Wither, and it reflected various aspects, I think, of aging and the pandemic, but it just got more and more, depressing. So I tried to find something that was more upbeat, and here it is. Although it does come from the tree who narrates this poem is kind of starting to feel a little bit down about the pandemic. It's called the neurasthenic oak tree. My nerves must settle down and soothe themselves. The worst of winter's gone. All my wiry branches will heal if only given a chance. The sun is pleasantly ticklish this morning. It makes my far twigs sparkle in the bright yellow buzz of sky-climbing bees. In the well-lit promise of April and June, its near and distant lover.
Oh, that's beautiful. And what a great way to end the show in anticipation of spring and the well-lit promise of April. Lee Slonimsky, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Sharon, and
been
thank
wonderful.
you for your really extremely, thoughtful and brilliant questions and insights into the book, many of which are really much deeper than I go. So,
I don't know about that, Lee. I don't think so.
I can tell you, as we said a few minutes before the show, I didn't see a connection between Vesuvius and the Lisbon Earthquake until you asked me to read them both. I honestly didn't. So.
Well, a lot of the unconscious stirrings are just, they remain that way even after you finish a book. Thank you so much.